All right, everyone. Welcome to our program. This is sponsored by the Mount Tabor Garden Club. Marta McDowell will be the presenter. Emily Dickinson's garden. And this is in memory of Vincent Wallace, our previous director, Jane Beeline's father. Marta, take it away.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to show you some pictures and we'll read some poems and talk about Emily Dickinson and her garden, which is certainly what intrigues me about this poet who has been popular ever since she was first published in the 1890s, so well over 100 years in print. That's a pretty good run. So Emily Dickinson, as a gardener, I thought we should start with a poem and this wonderful photograph. I did not take this picture. This was taken by the public relations person at the museum. The Emily Dickinson Museum is in Amherst, Massachusetts. And if you happen to be a birder as well as a gardener, Emily Dickinson was also very interested in birds and wrote a lot about them, including this poem. I shall keep singing. Birds will pass me on their way to yellower climes, each with a robin's expectation, I with my red breast and my rhymes. Late when I take my place in summer, but I shall bring a fuller tune. Vespers are sweeter than matins, Signor, morning only the seed of noon. So you can see there some of her garden imagery and some of the puzzle, her poems are always a little bit enigmatic. So if you don't understand them completely, trust me, neither do I, and neither do the scholars who write about her and talk about her all the time. Do they understand everything about her? She's known for being reclusive, which was certainly true, particularly at the end of her life, towards the end of her life, and that she preferred to wear white, again, later in life. But there's much more to her than just this iconic white dress. And this image, which is the only photographic image that absolutely we know is Emily Dickinson. I mean, can you imagine? She was from a reasonably well-off family, but only one photograph. So that is why so many, if you're an actress and you're portraying Emily Dickinson or you're coming up with the hair and costumes, they often put Emily Dickinson in an outfit like this with her hair pulled back very severely, even though her family said that really wasn't the way she wore her hair in later life. And there's the daguerreotype in its little case. It's actually quite small. So for me, I came across Emily Dickinson about 30 years ago. I was on a business trip, so I was driving across the state of Massachusetts and I was visiting insurance agencies. I worked for Prudential at the time. And I had an open afternoon on my schedule, which had meetings mostly from morning till night, and happened to be close to Amherst. And so I went up to what was then called the Emily Dickinson Homestead. And I discovered that afternoon that Emily Dickinson, like me, loved to garden because I always loved to garden in my own yard. And so I had one of these magical moments. This is my only special effect of the evening, where it just felt like, that over the rainbow moment where everything changes. And for me, it really did, because Emily Dickinson was the first topic I wrote about related to gardening that was ever put in print, first in an article, and then later as a book, and then later as another book. So I've been, writing about Emily Dickinson for a very long time. So I'll tell you a little bit about her life. These are her parents. Her father, Edward, was a lawyer, uh, and her mother was a homemaker. They were both interested in gardening. And in fact, Emily Dickinson once wrote to a friend, "I was reared in the garden, you know," which I don't think was actually true, but there you go. Emily Dickinson was the middle child of their three children. So Austin, her brother Austin, is in the center. He was a couple of years older. And on the right-hand side is her sister Lavinia, also called Vinnie. Emily was born in December. She was named for her mother. So they shared the same first name. And so she was a winter baby, 1830. This is the house where she was born. It didn't look like this when she was born there. Her grandfather had built the house. At the time when she was born in 1830, it would have been much plainer, and it was red brick. It didn't have a lot of the little extras. We'll talk about those later. This is also the house where Emily Dickinson died. She lived here for all her life, except for 15 years, when, for a complicated set of reasons, the family lost the house and they moved around the corner to another house. It wasn't too far away, maybe a quarter mile on North Pleasant Street. About that time, this is what Emily Dickinson looked like, at least in terms of one of those silhouettes. You know, an artist cut out this silhouette of her. And she would have gone to school. Oops. This was the house they were living in. So you see, it was a very nice, comfortable house. And she was going to school, again, nearby, kind of catty corner across the street from that house on North Pleasant Street, at Amherst Academy. The academy was sort of the equivalent of middle school and high school combined. So Emily went there for about 7 years. It was coeducational. It was a very, thorough curriculum. She studied Latin and arithmetic and sciences, including botany. So this was where she first had education about the technical side of plants. And she learned a lot of terms. This was the book they used at the time called Familiar Lectures on Botany by Mrs. Lincoln. Later she married and was Mrs. Phelps, so sometimes you'll hear the textbook refer to that, but it was used for a very long time in American education. She picked up terms like calyx and corolla and inflorescence and sepal, things like the parts of the flower. And I think of her kind of banking those terms, and you see them pop up later on in some of her poems. Also at this time, she started a collection which she called a herbarium. A herbarium is a collection of pressed plants. Nowadays, really the only people that collect herbarium specimens are people who are generally in some kind of botanical research. So for example, the New York Botanical Garden, where I teach, it has a huge herbarium collection where each plant is mounted on a separate sheet, and they have, I think, millions of specimens in the Steer Herbarium at NYBG. Emily's herbarium was a little different. It was a hobby at the time of many, particularly young women, and they would buy albums that were made specifically for the purpose of putting in a herbarium collection. So Emily's herbarium is like a photo album. It's 66 pages. It has an embossed leather cover. It has very heavy paper, and it's bound. And this is an example of one of those 66 pages. I'm not sure if you can see the details, but it's primarily one genus, and that genus is Viola. So you can probably see things that look like little violets, the way you'd get them in your yard or see them alongside a, kind of a woodsy forest. The blue violet is the New Jersey state flower. And I'll just enlarge one so that you can see it a little bit better. So this is a pansy, right? It's a little tiny pansy. You see them in the nurseries early, late April, late March, early April. And it's mounted. So you can see a little strip of paper here. I don't know what kind of glue they used, whether this was something they purchased or something more likely, I think, that they made at home. And then there's another strip of paper that says the scientific name. So it says Viola tricolor. And then there is a numbering system, which is the way they classified plants at the time. It was one of the classification systems, and it was counting the number of pistils and stamens, the number of, male and female parts in the flower. She called this plant Heart's Ease. And in fact, there's a little poem, I'm the Little Heart's Ease, that was written when she was young. I always called them Johnny Jumpa. You can grow them from seed. You can buy them, again, in a garden center, but they will come back if they're happy. They'll drop seed and come back. So it's very nice. But she wrote to friends about the herbarium and collecting plants for the herbarium. It's a combination of wild plants as well as garden plants. So it's great for someone like me who's looking for clues in terms of what did she grow in the garden and what did she see on her walks around Amherst. She wrote to a friend, I've been to walk tonight and got some very choice wildflowers. Have you made a herbarium yet? I hope you will if you have not. Most all the girls are making one. So again, this is, it was something that the kids did then. I don't know what kids are doing now, but they'll have these crazes and they'll be all making bracelets or making headbands or something. Later on, she also enclosed flowers in letters. And so this is one from 20 years later that she sent to a correspondent friend. This was someone at the time that she had never met. His name was Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and he was an editor at the Atlantic Monthly. He will come back into the story, but these amazing flowers, I mean, can you imagine? So these flowers, collected in the 1850s, again, how old is that? 1950, so well over 100 years old. They're still intact, which is astounding. They're now in the collection of the Boston Public Library. And you can see they're tied up. It must have been almost like a little nosegay. She sent them along with a poem. This will give you an example of Emily Dickinson's handwriting. It is legible, just barely. Some of it is very hard to read. But this says, south winds jostle them. Bumblebees come, hover, hesitate, drink and are gone. Butterflies pause on their passage cashmere. I, softly plucking, present them here. So what a nice package to get, right? Here is another one that she sent. I didn't have as good a picture of it, and someone has put a piece of Scotch tape over the little rosebud. It's always tempting to tape something down, but just remember, it's a terrible thing to do if something is eventually has to be saved because it yellows. And the poem goes, baffled for just a day or two, embarrassed, not afraid, encounter in my garden an unexpected maid. She beckons and the woods start. She nods and all begin, surely such a country I was never in. Her letters, some of them are actually quite funny, which is surprising. It was very surprising to me because I thought of Emily Dickinson as this person who only wore white and only wrote about death, right? Because the poems they tend to teach us in high school and college are things like, safe in their alabaster chambers, or because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. I mean, the famous ones really are kind of about death. But remember, she wrote about 1,800 poems, so she wrote about lots of different things, and many of them are quite upbeat. Same is true with our letters. She once wrote, I counted 3 peonies' noses, red as Sammy Matthews, just out of the ground. If you think about a peony and you look at one next spring, actually kind of next winter, because they start to emerge when the ground is still pretty frozen. They're quite red when they emerge. These are the old-fashioned, herbaceous peonies. And she was comparing them to their stable boy and his red nose. She said they're red as Sammy Matthews. Oh, and this is her aunt, Aunt Libby. She probably said aunt. Aunt Libby. This is Elizabeth Currier Dickinson. She said of Aunt Libby, she was her only male relative on the female side. And the letter goes on. It says, she hasn't starched the geraniums yet, but will have ample time. So she was good at making fun of people. Now, Dickinson also went to college for 1 year. She went to Mount Holyoke, what we now think of as Mount Holyoke College. Then it was called Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. She attended only for 1 academic year. Not sure why she came home, but many, many of the women who started with her the same year only stayed for just 1. It wasn't as unusual at the time. It seemed like the only women who stayed for the 4-year degree were women that intended to be missionaries. Most of them would marry a minister and go off and be a missionary somewhere afar. In fact, Emily Dickinson later on has pressed plants from places like the Holy Land where people would send her things. So that's Mount Holyoke. Here is her sister, Vinnie. Vinnie was, I think, quite a comedian, and she really was the social butterfly of the family. She was, particularly when Emily Dickinson got more reclusive, she was Emily's face to the outside world. So she interacted with people and did all the shopping and things like that. But she also gardened. And Emily Dickinson, one winter, was sitting in the house with her sister, and Emily's writing a letter, and Vinnie's doing something else, something that most gardeners do in the wintertime. And that was, Vinnie was looking through a garden catalog. It's a very lovely, elaborate catalog. I went back and found the issue because it was in 1881. And Emily Dickinson, in her letter, wrote, Vinnie is in Bliss's catalog, prospecting for summer. So the next time you're looking at a seed catalog or a catalog of plants in the winter, you can think of yourself as prospecting for summer. It was very interesting to me where the Dickinsons got their plants. We do know there were local suppliers. There were little local nurseries that advertised in the paper. So I went back through the old Amherst paper, and you saw where people could buy annuals or perennials in addition to vegetables. In the 1860s, the Massachusetts Agricultural College, what's now part of UMass Amherst, built a lovely glass house. This was a Lord and Burnham glass house. It is sadly no longer there. There's still a little greenhouse called the Durfee Greenhouse, but it's not the same one. But at the time, they sold plants as well. So we know that was another way they obtained plants. Emily Dickinson loved certain flowers in particular. So the daylily was one that she seemed to have a special affinity for. She once presented them as an introduction. Now, I had mentioned Thomas Wentworth Higginson earlier. She had this long correspondence with Higginson as an editor. So again, remember, he was at the Atlantic Monthly. The Atlantic Monthly was a brand new magazine at the time. And Higginson wrote an article encouraging young contributors for the magazine. And so Emily Dickinson wrote him a letter and enclosed some of her poems. And in her letter, she said, "Are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive?" Right? This must have been really a stunning letter to get. There's a wonderful book about it by Martha Ackman called These Fevered Days, about her correspondence with Higginson, among other things. And also the day that Higginson met her in person. So they started corresponding in the 1850s, well before the Civil War. They corresponded for a long time. He served in the Union Army. They kept writing. He always encouraged her to write, but not to publish. He would criticize her. He would say things like, "Your gait is too syncopated," right? It's not, her poetry wasn't regular. It's not like reading Whittier or one of the poets that was popular at the time, Longfellow. It's very modern in feel, which is why I think it still appeals to us today. So eventually he comes to visit at the homestead, at the Dickinson homestead. He happened to be in Amherst, and so he arranges to come see her. And she comes into the parlor where he's been brought by the maid or the housekeeper, and she hands him 2 daylilies and says in a sort of whispery voice, "These are my introduction." And then just goes on to talk, I think, kind of for an hour straight. She was a very intense person. He wrote to his wife that evening and said he'd never been so exhausted by a conversation with anyone in his whole life. So again, think about Higginson. He'll come back into the story one more time. Dickinson also would occasionally sign herself as Daisy, and the daisy appears over and over again in her poem. So we know that's another flower that she had a special feeling for. And they appear in the herbarium, I think almost like a coat of arms at the bottom of this page. They're very striking there. So in the 1850s, and I know I'm kind of jumping back and forth in time scale, her father purchased the old family homestead back from its interim owners. Remember, her grandfather built it, then her father loses it, he moves around the corner, and he buys it back. And then he does a big upgrade. I see it happening around my town. I'm in Chatham all the time, where, people will buy a house and they won't just move in anymore the way, we used to do when we were kids. They will do like a whole facelift on the house. So in the 1850s, Mr. Dickinson adds the cupola on top of the house. He adds the portico, this very classical portico on the front. He paints the brick yellow, which was a stunner, I'm sure, for everyone in town. Adds a porch. They called it the piazza. That is a great hint at the architectural style that they were aiming for, and that was Italianate. That was all the rage at the time. And then he puts up this fancy fence and a hedge. So it's really, here I am, I have now made it, I've recaptured my family homestead. Next door, he builds another house from scratch for his son and daughter-in-law, newlyweds, and they call it the Evergreens. It is Italianate from scratch. So this is what an Italianate house looks like. It has that tall tower. Again, it's supposed to look like a campanile, right? The bell tower in an Italian church. And as you see, Austin follows his father into the practice of law. He also went to Harvard Law School after Amherst College, and he joins him in a law partnership. Susan Gilbert had been a great friend of the family, a special friend of Emily Dickinson, and they continued with their friendship for a very long time, even after she married Austin. Or I should say, including after. And the house is still there, again, kind of amazingly. And you can see it, as we'll discuss later. Sorry, that's my fault. And we can see still a few of the plants that Austin planted. You know, remember it was called the evergreens. And you'll notice on the left, the big clump of rhododendrons, somewhat overgrown. There's never enough money to keep up the garden the way it should be. That quince that's in flower in front of the porch, that is an original plant planted during Emily Dickinson's life. And some of the trees are trees that Austin brought in as well. There was a path between the two houses, so they're really very close, even though it's a big piece of property, all told, with both houses and the outbuildings that would have been there and the property. It's about 3 acres. This is not a current photograph. This is a period photograph from the circa 1870s. It looks very contemporary, maybe the 1880s, because photography had, you know, really gotten started by then. And again, you see some of the evergreens that they were talking about. You can also see the hedge extended in front of the evergreens too, as well as the fence. Winter is good. Oh, we don't have to think about winter anymore. It's now summer. Winter is good. His whore delights, italic flavor yield to intellects inebriate with summer, or the world. Generic as a quarry, and hearty as a rose, invited with asperity, but welcome when he goes. Boy, I sure agree with that. There we go. A map. I always love a map. These are one of those old insurance maps. They're not like pinpoint accurate, but they give us a good idea of what the neighborhood was like. So the one with the circle around it is the homestead. You can see the homestead had a big barn, even though it wasn't quite positioned there, but it did have a big outbuilding. Next door, that's the evergreens, and there was also a small carriage house in between. Across the street is the Dickinson Meadow. It was a 10-acre meadow. So again, this might not be quite to scale, so quite extensive. And you can see a few other things. Behind the evergreens and the homestead, just about a block away, there's a cemetery. That is West Cemetery, and that is where Emily Dickinson and much of her family are buried. And then in the bottom of the picture, you see 2 things that remind us this is the industrial age. There was a factory within easy view of the homestead. That was a hat factory. They made palm hats. And the railroad had come to town. Actually, her father was instrumental in bringing the railroad to Amherst. There is the homestead at the time, a little etching, and you'll see another feature that we have not looked at yet that was put on by her father in the 1850s. And that was a small conservatory for the growing of plants in the winter. So it would not have been used in the summer. In the summer, it actually gets too hot in there. It's a small glass room. It was added to the exterior of the house. So it actually hangs off the exterior walls of her father's study and the dining room. And Emily Dickinson called this my little garden off the dining room, even though you entered it from her father's study or from the outside. The dining room windows are still in there, and they would open the windows if they wanted to keep the conservatory from freezing. So if it was going to go below freezing, which it often does in Amherst, they would open the dining room windows and crank up the stove that was in the dining room. And so that would keep the temperature just above freezing. Probably would still be a little on the cold side, but the plants wouldn't die. She grew lots of things in the conservatory, and she loved it. She often wrote about it. She said in one of her letters, "I have but to cross the floor to stand in the spice aisles." And if you think about stepping into a greenhouse in the winter and just inhaling and having that fragrance and moisture, of the plants and the soil and the flowers, it's a wonderful thing. And if you're Emily Dickinson, you say to stand in the spice aisles. It's good to be a poet. So she grew oxalis, and they grew oleanders and all sorts of scented geraniums, fuchsia. She liked to force hyacinth bulbs in the conservatory, which was fairly cool. And then she'd bring them up to her bedroom and let them completely open. And her niece, who was one of Austen's children, remembered that her aunt had a rainbow of hyacinths in her bedroom windows in the winter. And a little example of the scented geranium. I still have quite a few in my garden as a result. And of course, there was the garden outside. So it was down the hill on the east side of the house. And there's a long slope. And we know the flower garden was there from archaeology that's been done. At least we know where the path was. They haven't been able to tell us too much other than that. You'll notice now there's a large tree that shades much of the garden. That is a white oak that her brother planted. So it's quite a historic tree. But we do our best to keep things going. You can see the peonies there, they still bloom very nicely. Here is a short poem Emily Dickinson writes that's very summary. My garden like the beach denotes there be a sea. That's summer, such as these, the pearls she fetches, such as me. And again, in her poem, you don't know, is she talking about the pearls are poems, the pearls are flowers, the pearls are the poet? Kind of fun. I won't read this whole poem, but I did want to, in fact, I'll just stop sharing for a minute. I wanted to show you that I grow foxgloves too. So Emily Dickinson wrote about the foxglove. The foxglove is included in her herbarium. And they're very fun because they have these really lovely markings inside the tube of each floret that I always think of are like landing lights for bees. So that's a lot of fun. I have a very crowded garden because I read a lot, and I always want to have all of the plants that the authors are talking about. But I wanted to show you this one particular stanza, the third one. It says, when landlords turn the drunken bee out of the foxglove's door. And the other day I was watching a bumblebee just buzzing around inside this flower. It was just making the whole long stalk vibrate. And I had just thought about a landlord turning that drunken bee out the door. And you think, where is she seeing landlords and drunks? Maybe there were in Amherst too. So this is one example of the roses that the Dickinsons grew. Of all of the flowers in Dickinson's poetry and letters, the rose is the one that is mentioned most frequently. And they grew lots of different roses. Nowadays, if you want one of them, like this blush noisette, which is a kind of damask rose, you have to order from a place like the Antique Rose Emporium. You have to order it from an heirloom rose grower. I just ordered this plant this year, and amazingly, it looks like it's going to actually bloom, which, when I got it, it looked like, a few sticks with some soil on it. But it's got some buds on it. The blush noisette that we have been growing for the past about 4 years now at the Dickinson Museum is so fragrant that I can't speak highly enough of it. It's located in this bed, so it doesn't get sun all day, but it went from very tiny, they come as basically rooted cuttings, to this huge plant with just trusses and trusses of fragrant flowers that keeps blooming for a very long time. Many roses, they'll bloom for a couple of weeks and then they're done, but this one keeps on going. So just remember, blush noisette. Okay, I'll have to tell you about her bedroom because this is really the highlight of the tour. People want to see the bedroom because it is where she wrote most of her poems. So while they lived on North Pleasant Street, she wasn't really writing poetry yet. So the poems all get generated in this house. And when I first saw her bedroom, it was papered in a sort of beige and tan paisley. It was very pleasant, but it was very dull. And a few years ago, they decided to restore the bedroom almost down to the studs, to get doors that had been moved after the Dickinson period, to move them back and things like that. So they had taken the moldings off and they found a scrap of the original wallpaper, which they had an artist reproduce and they had it printed and hung. And it is such a huge change because now, instead of feeling like this woman was, wearing white and living in beige, you realize that she was writing in an interior garden as well, because it's just a trellis of roses. Absolutely fantastic. Oh, I should tell you too, if you're interested, in not COVID times, you can actually book a, like an hour writing session or drawing session in Emily Dickinson's bedroom in the off season. So they put you there at a little card table and, of course, you're not allowed to touch anything, but you can just sit there and absorb the atmosphere, which I did, and it was great fun. Emily Dickinson was also the family baker. She also played the piano. She did a lot of things. But she was known for her baking. She would sometimes enter things in the local county fair. This is one of her recipes. There are no directions. All you get is a list of ingredients, which a pound of sugar, a half a pound of butter, a half a pound of flour, 6 eggs, and a grated coconut, which does take a very long time to grate by hand. But the point here is not about Mrs. Carmichael's coconut cake recipe, but the fact that some of her poems are very much like recipes, which is not something I noticed, it's something a friend of mine noticed. She wrote a book, her name is Aoife Murphy, sorry, I cut the end of her name off. Her book is called Emily Dickinson, Made as Muse. And here is an example of one of those, what Aoife would call a recipe poem. To make a prairie, it takes a clover and 1 bee, 1 clover and a bee, and reverie. The reverie alone will do if bees are few. Again, she's not trying to be specific about this. We all know we need plants as well as bees and reverie. But it's a very interesting idea of putting together a poem as a list of ingredients. There's a bee. She didn't ever see a prairie specifically, but she certainly did see the meadow. And here is another angle on the Dickinson meadow, not in the direction of the hat factory, but in the direction of Amherst College, which at the time you could see quite clearly from the Dickinson household, which is no longer true. There are now more houses and trees and things. You can see the meadow. It had a little stream that ran through it. And again, one of her neighbors said this was always full of birds and bees and butterflies. So you get that feeling again of this was a place that certainly would have inspired Dickinson and so much of her nature poetry. Late in life, she makes a friend of sorts, someone that she never meets face to face. The woman's name was Mabel Loomis Todd, and Mabel lived sort of around the corner. She was new to town with her husband, and she made great friends with the Dickinsons, and actually in the case of Austin, got to be more than a friend. But she made for Emily Dickinson a little panel. It's a wooden panel that's painted, And it has on it something that is commonly called Indian pipe. If you've ever seen it, you're lucky. It's a really interesting member of the sort of plant kingdom. It's more related to fungus. It's a saprophyte. It doesn't photosynthesize, right? It's like evolutionary. In an evolutionary way, it's dropped all the chlorophyll and now just sort of hitchhikes on other plants and sort of swaps chemicals of various kinds. At any rate, Emily Dickinson was ecstatic about getting this panel and said to Mabel via a letter, "You have sent me the preferred flower of life." And indeed, Emily Dickinson wrote about Indian pipes. She has a poem, let's see, white as an Indian pipe, red as a cardinal flower, something like that. She also had Indian pipes in her herbarium. So Mabel Loomis Todd and Indian pipes. What intervenes is Dickinson's death. She dies in 1886. So she was 55 years old, just given where her birthday fell. She died, what's on the death certificate is Bright's disease, which seems like kind of one of those Victorian catch-alls, but it's some sort of kidney ailment. She hadn't been well for a period of time, and then she dies at home. She's buried again in West Cemetery. And after the funeral, her sister goes back to the house, and her sister had been asked to go through Emily's chest, the cherry chest in her bedroom, and burn all of Emily Dickinson's papers, which again was not an uncommon request at the time. Lavinia burns all of the letters that Emily Dickinson ever received, which for anyone who has done research, you know this is really traumatic. But then she comes across 40 booklets. Scholars call them fascicles now. And they were hand-sewn booklets full of poems. Now, they all knew that Emily wrote poems. She shared them with people. She sent them in letters. They had no idea how many she wrote. And really, it turns out that was not even half of them. But they were kind of her best that she'd copied out neatly and sewn together. So Lavinia could not bring herself to burn them. She said, "I had a Joan of Arc feeling about them." And you can still see them in book form the way she had them. Lavinia finds Mabel. Mabel finds Thomas Wentworth Higginson. They put out an edition of Emily Dickinson's poems, a small selection. They come out in 1890. Indian pipes, remember, those are Mabel's, so they get put on the cover. And it was immediately popular. So 2 more series followed, 2 more collections of poems, a 2-volume collection of letters, and they just keep going. They are, I will say, edited. So, for example, they added titles. Emily Dickinson did not have titles on her poems. So this was what they called the lost jewel. Just starts, "I held a jewel in my fingers. I went to sleep. The day was warm and winds were prosy." And look, they corrected her punctuation, right? Editors do that. Nowadays they go back and they change it all back to what she had. But that is the way they did it. And they changed some of the words as well. They certainly corrected her spelling. Anyway, so that's the story of Emily Dickinson's poems. She is published only slightly, like infinitesimally during her life, something like 10 or 12 poems total. We think really not with her consent, maybe with one small exception. And so she doesn't become famous until after her death. If you go to Amherst today, for any reason, do try to go to the museum, save an extra day. You can tour both houses. I think they're not quite open yet, but I'm hoping that by September they will be. They're beautifully interpreted. And the conservatory, which for 100 years had not been there, they put back finally in 2017. It had been taken off by, again, interim owners. And then it was put back on after a lot of archaeology and really meticulous research. So now you can go through her father's study, also restored, and step out into the conservatory and really get that feeling for what it was like to be there in the off season when the Dickinsons were mostly gardening indoors. You can, again, see some of the original plantings, see the house. It's beautiful at all seasons, but of course the autumn is glorious in New England. But I like summer because I like flowers. And again, when it's not COVID times, normally I'm up there a couple times during every growing season to help out. And we get a really nice group of volunteers. None of us wear white when we garden. I do not know if Emily Dickinson did. And just a closing poem. "'Tis customary as we part, a trinket to confer. It helps to stimulate the faith when lovers be afar. 'Tis various as the various taste. Clematis journeying far presents me with a single curl of her electric hair." And look at that seed pod. It looks electric indeed. So with that, I will just stop sharing and to see if any of you have any questions. You're welcome to just unmute yourself and ask.
First of all, you've done so much research. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I enjoy it. Now, she never married.
She never married, nor did her sister. And so they lived out their lives in their parents' home. So they lived there, you know, her father died first. Her mother was an invalid actually for a long time. So they cared for their mother. And then Emily dies in 1886 and Lavinia outlives her by quite a margin. I can't remember how many years.
Wow.
So Austin and Susan had 3 children, but only one of them lives a normal lifespan. One died as a child, fairly young. Another died, he was maybe late 20s or early 30s. And so the only one that survived was Martha, who married but had no children. She divorced not long after her marriage. And so that little branch of the Dickinson family died out, although there were lots of Dickinsons and Norcrosses. So there is still a big family left. It's just no direct descendants.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful. A lot of research.
Yeah, I do have a question. Actually, first of all, Marta, thank you. That was beautifully done and very much appreciated. But I'm disappointed there are no pictures of your garden.
That's a different talk.
Yeah, that's a different talk. Okay. But the question I have, the books that the first print edition books, are they can you see them if you go to Emily's home? Or are those in the museum?
Those are actually in the Amherst College special collections, has copies of the early editions.
Okay.
The handwritten, those fascicles, are all at Harvard, which seems odd, but Martha, that last surviving niece, decided that she would leave her home, the Evergreens, with a trust so that it and its contents would be protected. Those contents included a lot of Dickinson, Emily Dickinson memorabilia, including all of these poems, handwritten. And after Martha's death, the trustees ran low on funds for the Evergreens, for the Martha Dickinson Bianchi Trust, and sold what was the most valuable, which was the Emily Dickinson, much of the Emily Dickinson original collection. So part of it's at Amherst College and part of it's at Harvard. And there's a long, really feud about the publication because Mabel Loomis Todd was actually Austin's mistress, long-term mistress. Austin's wife was not keen on this, as you might imagine. She and her daughter had another set of poems that they published separately. And so they were dueling editions for decades.
Oh.
If you're interested, there's another book, a biography called, and this is a Dickinson quote, "Lives Like Loaded Guns."
Oh.
And, you know, there's a reason why the author picked that particular quote, because
Right.
it was not pretty. It was, you know, kind of surprising in its, you know, kind of modern twist. It sounds like something you'd read on the cover of a magazine while you're standing at the checkout line.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I will say, I do have from Leona, she said, thank you. That was lovely. And Jane said, thank you, Marta. Such an interesting program. And Ken and Pat said, thank you, Marta.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to let you know all about that. But does anyone have any other questions or comments that they would like to ask of Marta? Feel free to unmute yourself or not. You could
I
put it
think
in.
everything in my little, you know, I'm not much of a flower arranger, but so foxglove, clematis, we know she grew some kind. Feverfew is definitely a plant that she mentions and was in the herbarium, as well as Queen Anne's lace.
Oh. And are those all in your garden then?
They are all in my garden.
Okay, good. All right, so then that means you'll contact me next for a program about your garden.
There you go. Well, I have one. I have a program I do sometimes called The Pen and the Trowel. And it's about all these various authors and how all of their plants have influenced my garden.
Oh,
Excellent.
I think that sounds very interesting.
Very good.
Yeah, yeah. Rupa asks, Marta, you have woven the poetry and the gardening so smoothly. Thanks so much for sharing your fantastic research.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me and
All right.
spending your hour with Emily Dickinson and her flowers and poems.
Right.
Very nice.
Very much appreciated. If we don't have any other questions, then I will bid you all good night. Jane, stay safe there in Washington and don't go out in the rain. It'll be dangerous. All right. Thank you, Marta. Again, thank you, Mount Tabor Garden Club.
Thanks.
And we will talk to you later.
Very good. Thanks for
Good
your
night,
time.
everyone.
Bye.